All right, we have another great request. Chapter 4. Here we go. Another one for activity-based costing. So this request is exercise number 9 in your book, which should be number 4 in Cengage. So I'm going to put what it is in your book, number 9. Pink this time. All right, so where do we start? Like I said, I like to just know what the first problem is to get my head around what they're asking. So determine the overhead allocation for the batch of 200 monitors under the traditional overhead allocation base on direct labor. And then they're going to ask us determine the overhead allocation for the batch under ABC costing. So in the title of this problem, it says ABC overhead calculation, traditional versus ABC. So we're really going to be able to do a good comparison between what we learned in chapter 3, which were traditional methods, now compared to this ABC costing. So for the first one, we're going to do the traditional allocation. So they give us all of this information. The following overhead cost information is available for Bright LCD Corporation, a manufacturer of, I'm in the mood today to be artistic. Got our computer monitor, little on button. I'll just put a little keyboard too, so it really looks like a computer. So we've got a computer, right? Accountants are not artists. So they give us all this information by activity. And it's all broken out by overhead cost. Now, when you're asked to do an overhead calculation using traditional costing, it is not by activity, it's by total. Okay? Keep that in mind as we continue to read. So during the year, 1,000 purchase orders were issued, 300 shipments of materials. All of this stuff should start triggering. This has to do with activities. Okay? Activities worked a total. Employees worked a total of 10,000 direct labor hours on assembly of the monitors. The corporate managers are trying to decide whether they should use traditional overhead allocation method based on direct labor assembly hours or switch to an activity-based costing system. Assume that a batch of 200 monitors has resulted in the following cost activities. So again, all of this cost stuff. How are we supposed to come up with what our total overhead is based on traditional? So we have to go back to understanding what our predetermined overhead rate is. And predetermined overhead rate is taking the total expected overhead divided by the total expected base of activity. In this case, they tell us that traditional overhead allocation method is based on direct labor hours. So you have to know that. It's direct labor hours that they're allocating their overhead on under the traditional method. What is total overhead? Go back to your box of information. You have to add all of these overhead costs. Even though it's broken out by activity, the total, the 400,000, 100,000, 300,000, 125, 75, is the total overhead. So total overhead should come up to $1 million of total overhead. That's what the expected overhead. And then, what are we going to base that on? They told us it has to be direct labor hours. So what were the direct labor hours? It says employees worked a total of 10,000 direct labor hours on assembly of monitors. That has to be what our base is under traditional costing. This predetermined overhead rate, or the overhead rate, in this case, overhead allocation, should come out to $100 per direct labor hour. Does it tell you how many direct labor hours actually happened? So it can feel a little bit like a fishing expedition. Just how many hours? I don't know. Well, the question's asking us, go back to the question if you start feeling confused. Determine the overhead allocation for the batch of 200 monitors. So we're looking for 200 monitors. $200 of these bad boys. What How many hours did that take? Go back, search. We're looking for direct labor hours. Assume that a batch of 200 monitors had resulted in the following activities. We read purchase order. No, that's not what we're looking for. Shipments, machine setup, direct labor, assembly hours. Yes, that is what we're looking for at 50 hours. Okay, so it's 200 monitors. They told us it's 50 direct labor hours for assembly hours to produce these 200 monitors. You're going to take that 50 times that overhead rate of $100 to come up with $5,000. So $5,000 is what is applied or allocated for the batch of 200 monitors. So this $5,000 is overhead allocated for the batch of 200 monitors. Remember, this is for traditional costing. Okay, so that's our answer. 5,000 in overhead is going to go toward these. Remember, we're not talking about direct materials. We're not talking about direct labor. We're talking about overhead. Don't get confused that we're using direct labor hours as a base, but it really has nothing to do. The number is not the direct labor hours. The direct labor hours is a cost in and of itself. This is the most powerful number that they think is used to allocate this overhead. Remember, it is an estimate. So now let's take a look at B. Determine the overhead allocation for the batch under ABC costing. Let's shrink this little guy up here. I won't bore you with another computer drawing. I'll leave it to very exciting things like calculating this overhead using ABC costing. So where do we need to start? Remember, we have to start with coming up with that predetermined overhead rate by activity. It gives us the activities. We have purchasing, we have receiving, we have machine setup, we have assembly, we also have quality control, and then they give us the total cost of overhead. 400,000, 100,000, 300,000, 125,000, 75,000. And what are we going to divide it by? The base. So the base, we have to go, and it's the base in total, not per order. So go back to that second paragraph of information. During the year 1,000 purchase orders were issued. That one. Not that second box that's saying, here's the activity from the 200 orders. Remember, when you're trying to allocate this overhead rate for ABC costing, you're using total overhead by total activity. So for purchasing, it tells us the base is purchase orders. They say during the year 1,000 purchase orders were done. So the base is 1,000. For the receiving, it's the number of shipments. So 300 shipments were received. For machine setup, based on number of setups, they tell us 600 setups took place. For assembly, direct labor hours, and it tells us that the employees worked a total of 10,000 direct labor hours for assembly. And then for quality control, it's based on number of inspections, and it tells us that there were 750 inspections conducted. So again, you just do this simple math out. we get 400 per purchase order. This should come out to $333.33 per shipment of material. Then we get, for machine setup, 500 per setup. And then for assembly, we should get $12.50 per direct labor hour. And then quality control, 100 per inspection dollars. Now we have the rates. And then we have to just simply apply those to the 200 monitors that we're actually trying to figure out the allocation for those. And they give us that small bit of information there. And I'm just going to shrink this guy up a little bit so we've got some room. So for purchasing, actually I'm just going to a tiny bit bigger. For purchasing, we're going to use the $400 per purchase order times how many purchase orders actually happened. They said 7. So times the number that actually happened, we should come up with $2,800. Now for receiving, how many shipments of materials were received? 12. So we'll use it by that rate. The $333.33 per shipment times the 12 shipments that actually happened. So that should be $3,999.96. For machine setup, we're looking for per setup. How many setup hours do these setups happen? 2. Multiply it by 2. We get to 1,000. Then for assembly, do we need direct labor assembly hours? That was 50 hours. So that should come up to $625. And then for quality control, it was based on number of inspections. There were 3 times the $100 per inspection, so we get $300. So now we come up to $8,724.96. What is this number? Total overhead allocated to the batch of 200 monitors, not keyboards, just monitors, right? Now when you compare this number, this question isn't asking for this. All it's asking was to do the 2 methods. You did the 2. You based it on total overhead by, this was the ABC costing, and then we did the traditional costing up here. Notice, 5,000 was allocated under traditional, 8,724 under ABC. You can see much more detail in the ABC costing, but this gives a better allocation of the overhead to these computers. So where'd the rest go? Maybe something, if this was, say you're looking at traditional, only 5,000 was allocated before, we'd say maybe that was under allocated because the more detail tells us it should be basically 8,700. Maybe something else was over allocated. Whatever the case may be, generally speaking, ABC is a much better breakout of detail, leading to a much more accurate overhead cost. But as we can see, it takes more time. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. Please let me know if it didn't. I appreciate your time.